Hey friends, it's Gloria and welcome back to another video. Today I'm going to be chatting about all of the books that I got to read in the month of September. I thought it was not going to be very many given that I was on a trip traveling abroad, but somehow when I got home I just couldn't stop reading. And so today I have 22 books to talk about, which is a lot. Granted, some of them are picture books and graphic novels, but still I have lots to cover. So let's get into it. The first category of books that I'm going to cover, I'm calling my UK books. These were either books set in the UK or have to do with it. I was just in the mood to read after my trip. And so let's start off with number one. The book that I read on my trip was Bridget Jones's Diary by Helen Fielding. I recently hauled this from a little free library adventure and I thought I should pick it up. This book is a classic rom-com. It's supposedly a Pride and Prejudice retelling. There is a movie based off this book that I had never watched before that I downloaded on my phone to watch on my flight back once I finished this book. This book did help me in my jet lag, sometime between 11 p.m. and 4 in the morning when I was suffering and I couldn't fall asleep. I was reading this book in my hotel room. And unfortunately, I apologize for all those that are fans of this book. I just do not understand. I hated this book. It was absolutely horrible to read. I was so annoyed with the character and the life decisions she was making, and I just really do not get along with like the British crude humor. This is about a 30-something-year-old Bridget Jones who smokes a lot, drinks a lot, sleeps around, and it's the new year and she has goals to change those habits. And so she tracks her progress in diary entries. And just sitting in this character's mind space of having absolutely horrendous body image dysmorphia, like it was just horrible to read. And she's 125 pounds in this whole book and she thinks that she's fat and just hates herself. And I just couldn't be in that headspace. I hated every minute of it. There's a love triangle between very dumb people in this book. It was not good. I don't understand the hype. I don't understand why people love this. I then watched the movie and I didn't love the movie either. It was very true to the book, so there's that. But I should have known that this was not going to be the book for me. But for whatever reason, I read it and realized that, learned my lesson. Won't be keeping this one around. Next up, another rom-com I picked up was The Road Trip by Beth O'Leary. And this one I read from start to finish on my flight home. And it was a very entertaining read for that. I'm glad that I read it then. It kept me engaged. This is what they call a second chance romance, I think, which is where two people fall in love. They have some sort of mysterious breakup that you're not aware of at the start of the book. It later gets unveiled. And then eventually in the end, they get back together. And I will say the first 50% of this book, I loved. I was in it. It was all about how they first fell in love and met, I believe in France or Italy or somewhere. And it was really fun. And then as the drama unfolded and like the big reveals happened of why certain characters were miscommunicating and why that miscommunication was happening, I just found myself rolling my eyes. I also did not really love the side characters. So this was a 3-star read, like pretty much every other rom-com I have read at this point, but it was a fun time. I'm glad I read it, no regrets. It just wasn't, the best thing ever. Another contemporary book that is set in the UK that I picked up was Eleanor Oliphant is Completely Fine by Gail Honeyman. I mentioned this book in a book haul and so many of you said you loved it and it kind of moved up to my priority list. And this book was good. I landed on 3 stars. I'm glad I read it. It is exactly what I thought it was going to be, which is like this quirky main character who has some sort of past or trauma that she hasn't worked through, and she finds her found family, makes new friendship, and is able to overcome her grief. In this book particular, there is a lot more heaviness around the trauma that she needs to overcome, so look up your trigger warnings there. But I have a theory now that books with the main character's name in the title are not books that I'm gonna love. They always land around 2 or 3 stars for me. For example, A Man Called Ove or The 100 Years of Lenny and Margot or Eleanor Oliphant. They are just not hitting me in the heartstrings and make me emotional like I imagine these books do for so many other people. For whatever reason, it's a me problem and I don't get that impact. And it's a really good story. And I'll mention in a bit that I've read a nonfiction that has to do with overcoming trauma and grief and working through something. But for some reason in nonfiction it works, or in a memoir, and in fiction it doesn't quite do it for me. And I'm not really sure why. I mean, I'm glad I read it. Didn't have a bad time, but ultimately this will be very forgettable and I don't imagine myself keeping this book on my shelves or ever rereading it. A historical fiction that I started on my trip and finished when I got home is The Kitchen Front by Jennifer Ryan. This book was on my 12 fiction books to read in 2022. When I first heard of this book's premise, I immediately added it to my TBR. I thought, okay, a cooking competition set during the war in London, how fun, and the execution fell a little bit flat for me. me. I think I landed on 2.5 stars with this one. Ultimately, 4 different women, 4 different perspectives. At the beginning of the novel, they all hate each other, despise each other. There's like this weird childlike hate and animosity that I really didn't enjoy. And then eventually over time, they become friends at the end of the book. But it takes a long time for the friendship to get there. And there's also really despicable men, you know, to hate in this book. Everything kind of just felt one-noted and flat. For those various reasons, it didn't work for me like I thought it would. But I will say for fans of World War II, multiple perspective historical fiction centering around food, I would maybe give this one a try, and don't let my experience sway you. The food imagery and description and the way that these characters were creating their dishes really worked well in this book, and that was like the highlight that I looked forward to. So pros and cons, not my favorite, but I'm glad I checked it off the list. Next up, I have 3 nonfiction reads set in the UK. First one I spotted in my library and immediately took it home with me based on the title, and that is A Castle in England by Jamie Rhodes. This is a graphic novel and another example where the premise sounded excellent, execution not so much. This is supposed to be a graphic novel based on one castle in England and the different people that lived in this castle and their stories and different events that happened. Sounds really interesting. Unfortunately, it didn't work. The art style, unfortunately, was just way too kind of scribbly, messy. The flow of the dialogue didn't really work, and interspersed between the actual like art style is just very basic facts. This happened here at this time period with these characters, and that's it. There was no creative writing, there was no flourishing, there was no effort. I think the attempt at making the story more interesting was the graphic novel art style part, but again, just didn't really work for me, so that was a bummer. I then picked up The Salt Path by Rainer Wynn. This is a memoir that was so beautifully written. I would highly recommend, especially for fans of Wild by Cheryl Strayed, which I actually haven't read yet, but I have watched the movie. So if you liked that story or that book, I would highly encourage you to pick this one up. This is about a woman, Rainer, and her husband who, for unforeseen circumstances, get kicked out of their home and become homeless. And at the same time, her husband is diagnosed with a terminal illness. And instead of, I don't know, staying put and trying to figure that out, they decide to walk the southwest coast path of England, which is a 630-mile path along the coast. And that's what they do. And you follow along that journey, them overcoming their circumstances, dealing with houselessness, trying to find food, being hungry all the time, her husband dealing with incredible pain, and just all the random people and characters that they meet and kind of shenanigans that goes along with that journey. I thought it was a beautifully told story. It made me very empathetic. I encounter homelessness here on a daily basis in Portland, both in the city and now at my job at the library. We have houseless people coming in all the time, and I think this book just made me see the bigger picture of what that person is experiencing and what maybe could have led them to that place. So again, would highly recommend. Next up, one of my favorite reads in September was A Fine Romance, Falling in Love with the English Countryside by Susan Branch. This book was like drinking a hot cup of tea or getting a hug from a friend or just sitting in a cozy blanket by the fire. It was so heartwarming and so wholesome. This is essentially a travel diary scrapbook from Susan Branch's experience traveling the English countryside with her husband for 2 months in 2012. She is highly inspired by Beatrix Potter, and one of the main things was to go visit Beatrix Potter's house, but they also visit a lot of other things along the way. But this entire book was handwritten by the author, and also she's a watercolor painter, and so she includes watercolor paintings of things that she saw, and also there are inserts of photographs from the things that she's talking about in her diary entries. This book was just beautiful and lovely, incredibly relatable. A couple of things I got to see that she saw on her trip, but also just the experience of traveling around England and the different people and things you encountered and things you saw along the road in the countryside. Me and my husband all got to see, and so I just loved every minute of this and would recommend for those that are travel lovers and also anyone who is interested in visiting the English countryside. This will make you fall in love with it. So all done with UK books, moving on to nonfiction. I've been really in a nonfiction mood. I think as the season has transitioned from summer to fall, I'm just in the mood to read all the nonfiction, which is good because I love my nonfiction reads. I picked up The Day the World Came to Town, 9/11 in Gander, Newfoundland by Jim DeFeed. I read The Only Plane in the Sky last year, which was an incredible book about the events of 9/11. And since then, I've had some more books about 9/11 pop onto my radar, this being one of them, and decided to read it this month. And this was also an excellent read. Although hard to read based on the subject matter, it also was so wholesome because this showed the love that strangers can show one another. During the events of 9/11, because the US closed down airspace, planes that were coming in from Europe had to land somewhere, and so they landed in Gander, Newfoundland. About 38 planes landed in this tiny little city, and people were stranded there for multiple days, and the whole city came together to help all of these people. And just human resilience, caring for one another, loving the stranger, it just showed the goodness of people, and I teared up all throughout this book. It was a beautiful read. Would highly recommend if you're interested. Another nonfiction memoir I picked up this month was Finding Me by Viola Davis. Now, I read celebrity memoirs now and again, but what will make me pick one up is if someone says it's narrated by the author themselves, and Viola Davis's narrates her audiobook, so I listened to that, and it was a really great read and listen. Viola Davis goes into her childhood, her upbringing, and ultimately how she became an actor. It was really interesting. It wasn't as impactful or wow like I thought it was going to be, which I feel really bad saying because it was beautifully written and told, and this was her life story. Again, still a really good read and really interesting if you wanted to learn more about Viola Davis's life or how to get into acting or the start of acting career, but I landed around 4 stars with this one. Also in September, for whatever reason, I finally decided to pick up Atomic Habits by James Clear. But this book is so hyped. I thought it was going to be the ultimate best self-help nonfiction that I've ever read, and I don't know if it's just because of the hype, but it didn't really live up to that for me. I landed on 3.5, 4 stars with this one. What I found was that this was mostly about habit theory and less about practical things you change in your life, and a lot of it was common sense. Still a great read, especially if you are interested in habits and creating new ones, breaking old ones, etc., but maybe just didn't live up to the hype for me. A nonfiction book that really didn't work for me, I felt way too stupid, was What If? Serious Scientific Answers to Absurd Hypothetical Questions by Randall Munroe. This author is like a webcomic creator, like a meme creator, and I think he was an engineer or scientist, and he basically had a bunch of hypothetical questions that he culminated in this book. I first heard of this book because the sequel to this book, What If 2, is coming out or just came out in October, November, and then I saw that there was a first one, and so I checked this one out, and it was a short audiobook. And maybe what I thought this book was going to be was like a Mythbusters thing. I thought it was going to be more entertaining, but it really was maybe 15% entertaining, and the rest was just boring scientific information about stuff that I don't care about. So this book is what the subtitle says. There are absurd hypothetical questions, and the author goes into the very real science of what would happen if those things occurred. And unfortunately, I was just mostly bored out of my mind. So all that to say, I will not be picking up the sequel, but this might work for those that are really, really, really into science. It could be funny and entertaining for you. The next book that I'll mention is actually a book that I finished on the UK trip with my husband. We were listening to the audiobook, but this doesn't have anything to do with the UK, so I didn't mention it in that first category of books. That is The Hunger Games by Susan Collins. This is a reread for me, but my husband's first time reading these books, and we are making our way through the series. We'll probably be reading about 1 book a month and hoping to complete the trilogy and the prequel by the end of the year. This is a young adult science fiction dystopian novel, a classic at this point, so beloved, and it is really fun and entertaining. It still holds up. We both landed around 4.5 stars. It's not quite perfect for me, but it's pretty great, and I am loving being back in this world. Next up, I will touch on 5 graphic novels that I read in September. The first one is Garlic and the Witch by Brie Paulson. This is book 2 in this series. The first one was Garlic and the Vampire. This is an adorable little middle grade series about little vegetable creatures living in the woods and the adventures that they go on, Garlic being the main character. It is very sweet and light and simple. A great story, a great continuation. Would recommend. It's very basic. Like, there's not much to it, but it's sweet. Another middle grade nonfiction graphic novel I picked up is El Deafo by Cece Bell. This book is all about Cece Bell's experience in elementary school, being deaf, feeling different, feeling like an outcast, trying to fit in, trying to make friends. And I feel really bad for saying that I only gave this 2 stars. This book really just didn't work for me. And it wasn't about the deaf part. That was actually very interesting to learn. I was just honestly so annoyed with the main character, this girl who just had an attitude about everything. And I feel bad again for saying that because she has to overcome the circumstances and deal with being deaf. But she just is so ungrateful for everything. She treats her parents like crap. She's really mean to her friends. And it was just this overall like angst of being a kid and like being a teenager kind of, or like a preteen, that I didn't really love reading about, and I never feel like there was an arc or redemption or like learning. It just kind of ended with that feeling, and so unfortunately I didn't really love this one. So yeah, that's probably an unpopular opinion, me thing, I'm sorry. Another nonfiction graphic novel I picked up was Photographic, The Life of Graciela Iturbide. This is a book that I picked up, perfect for Hispanic Heritage Month, all about this photographer's experience and career and the things that she photographed. specifically in Mexico. This book was strange. There were some really interesting moments in it, very unique pockets and stories of Mexican culture that I would never have otherwise known about. So that was really cool to read. Unfortunately, the way that this graphic novel was put together really didn't work. It was incredibly choppy. The parts that I wanted more, I didn't get enough because it was just a couple pages. It jumped around in the timeline a ton. It had like some vague paragraphs of this author philosophize and understand her life, and some bits of just abstract thought, which was a bit strange. So I landed with 3 stars. A graphic novel that I picked up and did not finish this month is An Unreliable History of Tattoos by Paul Thomas. The title is what got me. I actually really love tattoos. I don't have any, but I really want to get one someday. So I thought that this was going to be a book about tattoos, but no, it is not. This book is a nonsensical retelling of British history that just doesn't make any sense. This book was pure garbage. It was absolutely made up nonsense, lots of vulgarity, language, nudity, just again like icky, crude feeling, artistic style. It didn't make any sense. It was so weird and I just couldn't continue it, so I put it down. And then moving on to the final graphic novel in this category, Ermina by Barbara Yellen. Again, picked this up just randomly on a whim at the library, and this was a historical fiction strongly based on real events about the woman Ermina. She was a young woman on a foreign exchange in England. She ended up falling in love with a black man, but then because events of the war happened, she moved back to Germany, ended up losing touch with him, marrying a Nazi officer, having a child, and being like a proper German woman. This graphic novel brings up the question that we have of like how ordinary citizens in Germany were able to kind of just fall under the Nazi regime and do what they did, or turn a blind eye to the things that they were seeing. And this brings up those themes, and it was really interesting, well done. I really like the format of this book, so I'm glad that I read this one. We are nearing the end, I promise. We just have some picture books. The first one is a book also picked up on a whim at the library, and that is The Well of Being, a children's book for adults. This book was also another kind of nonsensical book for me, one that I felt too stupid to understand. This is technically categorized under philosophy, so maybe for those that read philosophy, they would better understand and connect with this one. I did not. This book did read like a picture book because every single page there was like a watercolor illustration and then a couple words, but I just could not connect with what this author was trying to convey. So yeah, didn't work for me. Moving on to actual picture books, I picked up these two based on Randy Lynn Reed's channel. She creates really beautiful videos, very similar to Morgan Long and Darling Desi. These were recommendations in her recent Cozy Autumnal video, Woodland Dreams, and It Starts with the Seed. Both of these are perfect picture books for this time of year. This one, It Starts with the Seed, is all about a tree that grows and how it starts with the seed and then it continues becoming a tree and gets bigger and bigger. It has like these cool fold out pages. It was lovely. And then Woodland Dreams is all about the different woodland creatures and how they sleep and the different places they sleep. And it was also just very adorable illustration style, lovely images and color. This next one also fits really well with this time of year, but it's actually a full seasonal book, so it covers each of the 4 seasons. Little Witch Hazel, A Year in the Forest by Phoebe Wall. I read a couple of Phoebe Wall's books earlier this year for Picture This Readathon, and so I was very excited to pick this one up, and it was adorable. This book has not only stunning illustrations but also a really lovely story throughout, and I love this one. Would highly recommend. And then to wrap up this video, the last 2 picture books I picked up were also on a whim. I'm borrowing a bunch of picture books from my mother-in-law. Most of them were books that my husband read when he was a kid or were read to him, and a couple are just picture books that she had from being a 2nd grade teacher. And so I picked up An Egg is Quiet. This book is all about eggs. It's more informational and kind of scientific, different color eggs from different animals, and there's very sweet, really pretty illustrations in here. The last book is one that was my husband's favorite when he was a kid, and that is Caps for Sale, A Tale of a Peddler, Some Monkeys, and Their Monkey Business by Sfira Slobodinka. This book was very sweet and cute, very reminiscent of that style from a lot of classic picture books of being repetitive. You just kind of repeat the same lines over and over again. This one is about a man who sells some colored caps and some monkeys that steal those caps and then return it to him at the end. And it's, again, very sweet, very funny. Glad I read the one. I was unfamiliar with that one from childhood or anything like that. So that wraps up my September reading. Some great reads, some not so great reads, stuff in between. Thank you so much for watching and tuning in today, and I will see you guys in another book video soon. Bye!